On a ridge 1,600 feet above the Pacific Ocean, a pair of bronze doors stand closed against the wind. Beyond them, 115 rooms sit in deliberate silence. 70,000 square feet of stone, tile, and imported ceilings overlook 127 acres of terraced gardens. At night, the Neptune pool reflects a colonnade modeled after ancient Rome, its surface disturbed only by coastal air rising from the cliffs below. The hill was once known simply as La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. Today, the towers of Casa Grande can be seen from miles away, pale against the California sky, their silhouettes recalling Mediterranean cathedrals rather than a private American home. The structure appears immovable, anchored into the hillside as if it had always been there. But the estate did not emerge from inevitability. It was assembled piece by piece, stone by stone, ceiling by ceiling, financed by a fortune measured not in land or industry, but in ink and circulation numbers. The house was meant to function as more than shelter. It was a stage set for influence, a constructed horizon from which its owner could look outward and see his dominion mirrored in architecture. Yet the moment the hill reached its fullest expression, its towers completed, its pools filled, its Guesthouses occupied by politicians and actors, the financial machinery that sustained it began to strain. Debt expanded quietly beneath the spectacle. Newspapers that once generated unprecedented profits faced structural change. Expansion outpaced revenue. Confidence masked fragility. Hearst Castle was designed to suggest permanence. It conveyed solidity through stone, antiquity through imported fragments of Europe's past, and continuity through ritual gatherings at the top of the hill. But permanence requires more than walls. It requires a system capable of sustaining them. What happens when a palace built to immortalize personal power must depend on an empire that can no longer guarantee its own survival? Long before towers crowned the ridge, the hill was open grassland. In the 1860s, cattle moved across it in slow, practical lines. The Pacific wind cut through dry brush and coastal sage. There were no terraces, no fountains, no imported ceilings wrapped in protective crates. Only ranch hands, livestock, and an ocean that did not care who owned the view. The land that would become Hearst Castle was originally part of a vast Mexican land grant known as Rancho Piedra Blanca. After California shifted into American hands, ownership fragmented. By 1865, a 43,000-acre stretch along the central coast was purchased by a prospector-turned-investor named George Hearst. He had made his fortune in silver and gold mines across Nevada and South Dakota. The California coast was not a primary investment, it was acreage, productive, remote, and largely unremarkable. George Hearst was practical. He was not building monuments. The San Simeon Ranch functioned as a working property. Cattle grazed. Sheep were raised. The land's value lay in its scale, not in its visibility. It was far from San Francisco, farther still from Washington. No major rail line cut directly through it. Access required endurance. When George died in 1891, his holdings passed to his only son, William Randolph Hearst. At that time, the ranch was simply one component of a larger inheritance: mining interests, real estate, and most importantly, newspapers. The younger Hearst was 28 years old. He had already begun reshaping the San Francisco Examiner into an instrument of mass readership, blending spectacle with politics. But San Simeon remained peripheral, a summer retreat at best, a memory of childhood rides across open hills. William's mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, spent occasional seasons there. She built modest improvements, a ranch house, barns, practical structures. She preferred Berkeley and European travel. San Simeon was rural, isolated, even inconvenient. It did not yet carry symbolic weight. In photographs from the 1890s, the hill appears bare. The coastline stretches uninterrupted, cliffs descending sharply into the Pacific. A simple wooden lodge sits low against the terrain. Nothing suggests empire. Nothing predicts towers. At the turn of the 20th century, William Randolph Hearst was becoming one of the most powerful media figures in America. He expanded aggressively into New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Circulation wars defined his early career. His papers influenced elections, framed foreign conflicts, and manufactured celebrity. By 1900, he controlled multiple publications in major cities. By 1910, his holdings included magazines, syndicates, and wire services. His name was synonymous with reach. Yet San Simeon remained largely untouched. It served as a private refuge, a place for camping trips, horseback rides, informal gatherings. Guests arrived by train and carriage, enduring a long journey from urban centers. The discomfort was part of its character. The hill did not perform for anyone. It offered distance. In these early decades, the ranch did not represent ambition. It represented escape. William's political aspirations began to falter in the 1900s. He ran for mayor of New York City and lost. He pursued the governorship and failed again. His presidential ambitions dissolved quietly. The newspapers remained profitable, but the path to formal political power narrowed. San Simeon still sat outside that struggle. It was not yet a solution or a symbol. It was inherited land, expansive, private, and largely irrelevant to the industrial East Coast battles that defined his career. When Phoebe Hearst died in 1919, the character of the ranch shifted subtly. Her presence had been moderating, restrained. With her death, full control passed to William. By then, he was in his mid-50s, wealthy beyond comparison to most Americans, and accustomed to shaping public narrative. The First World War had ended. The United States was entering a decade of economic expansion. On the hill, however, very little had changed. The main residence remained a comfortable but unremarkable house. Wind moved across open fields. Cattle still grazed. The ocean continued its rhythm. Few observers would have identified San Simeon as a future architectural statement. It was distant from the established social circuits of Newport or Palm Beach. It lacked the lineage of European estates. There was no cathedral nearby, no aristocratic history embedded in its soil. Its isolation worked against prestige. Even within Hearst's expanding business network, the ranch did not command attention. Executives focused on circulation numbers, printing presses, acquisitions. Advertisers cared about readership demographics, not coastal acreage. The empire's pulse beat in urban newsrooms, not on a hill above the Pacific. And yet, the land possessed one quality that other properties did not: uninterrupted control. It was private, vast, and elevated. From the ridge, the horizon belonged entirely to the owner. There were no neighboring mansions to compete with, no established architectural style to conform to. The hill imposed no expectation. In the early 1920s, when guests visited, they described the view more than the buildings. The coastline felt ancient. The Pacific appeared endless. The absence of development suggested possibility rather than history. San Simeon did not matter because it did not yet signify anything. It was not a financial engine. It was not a political platform. It was not a cultural landmark. It was land, inherited, stable, and quiet. But in its quiet, it offered something rare: a blank elevation high enough to hold an idea. At the time, no one standing on that hill could have predicted that within a decade, imported ceilings from Spanish monasteries would be suspended overhead. No one could have imagined that European tapestries would hang where cattle once passed. The ranch had no mythology. It had no architectural identity. It was simply a remote stretch of California coast owned by a man whose influence was exercised elsewhere. And because it did not matter, it was free to become something else. In 1919, shortly after his mother's death, William Randolph Hearst wrote a letter to architect Julia Morgan. The request was restrained. He wanted to build a little something on the hill at San Simeon. The phrase was misleading. Morgan, already an accomplished architect and the first woman licensed in California, understood both terrain and scale. When she first surveyed the ridge, she encountered wind, unstable soil, and isolation. Transporting materials would require coordination across miles of undeveloped land. Water systems would need to be engineered upward. Labor would have to be housed on site. The hill did not resist construction, but it demanded discipline. What began as a modest house evolved into a compound. The central structure, Casa Grande, was designed in a Spanish Revival style influenced by Iberian cathedrals. Two towers framed its facade, inspired by the twin bell towers of the Church of Santa Maria la Mayor in Ronda, Spain. The visual reference was deliberate. Hearst did not merely want a residence, he wanted architectural lineage. Construction stretched across decades. Rather than following a single master blueprint, the estate grew through ongoing revision. Hearst sent Morgan sketches, clippings, and annotated photographs from Europe. He purchased ceilings from monasteries, fireplaces from French chateaux, choir stalls from Spanish churches. Entire rooms were shipped across the Atlantic, dismantled and catalogued. The scale accumulated gradually. Casa Grande alone would reach approximately 68,500 square feet. 3 Guesthouses, Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, and Casa del Sol, added another 47,000 square feet combined. In total, the hill held 115 rooms, including 38 bedrooms and 42 bathrooms. These numbers did not exist for excess alone. They created hierarchy. Guests were assigned rooms according to rank. Proximity to Hearst's own suite indicated favor. The architecture enforced social calibration without spoken instruction. The estate's materials communicated permanence. Reinforced concrete formed the structural core, disguised beneath stone and tile to evoke antiquity. At a time when many American mansions relied heavily on wood framing, Morgan engineered Casa Grande to withstand earthquakes. The exterior suggested a transplanted European past, the interior concealed modern infrastructure, heating systems, elevators, call buttons embedded discreetly into carved wood. Hearst insisted on authenticity, but authenticity was curated. The Neptune Pool, perhaps the most photographed feature of the estate, underwent 3 separate redesigns between 1924 and 1936. Marble colonnades framed the water. Classical statues stood in calculated positions. The pool's length, 104 feet, created the illusion of Roman continuity. Yet its plumbing was entirely contemporary, engineered to maintain clarity against the coastal climate. Nearby, the Roman pool, an indoor swimming hall tiled in cobalt and gold mosaic, referenced ancient baths. 8 marble statues lined its perimeter. Light filtered through alabaster panels, diffused and theatrical. The room was not a relic, it was an interpretation of antiquity constructed in reinforced concrete. Numbers conveyed ambition indirectly. By the mid-1930s, Hearst's expenditures at San Simeon were estimated in the millions, during a period when the average American annual income hovered around $1,500. The estate consumed capital continuously. There was no defined completion date. The hill functioned as an active project site for nearly 3 decades. Morgan maintained structural coherence despite the evolving program. Terraces descended in measured steps. Gardens were organized to frame views outward toward the Pacific. The approach road curved deliberately, preventing immediate visual comprehension. The castle revealed itself gradually, tower by tower. Symbolism permeated details. Heraldic emblems were embedded into ceilings. Carved wooden doors bore coats of arms not necessarily connected to Hearst's lineage but evocative of dynastic authority. The library contained thousands of volumes, arranged beneath a 16th-century Spanish ceiling painted with astronomical symbols. The room suggested scholarship and continuity, though its owner's empire depended on daily headlines. San Simeon was not patterned after a single palace. It was an assemblage, fragments of Europe recomposed on an American hill. The act of collection became architectural language. Hearst was not inheriting centuries of aristocratic heritage, he was importing it. The estate's construction schedule mirrored the expansion of his media holdings. As newspapers acquired competitors and circulation figures climbed, additional rooms were authorized. Guesthouses multiplied. Decorative programs intensified. The hill reflected growth in real time. But ambition expressed physically carries a unique quality: it resists concealment. A newspaper's circulation decline may remain abstract. A financial deficit can be negotiated in ledgers. A stone tower, once raised, remains visible. By the late 1920s, the compound had transformed the ridge entirely. Where cattle once moved uninterrupted, terraces now controlled the horizon. The silhouette of Casa Grande imposed vertical authority against the coastal sky. Hearst's intent was clear: the estate would operate as a private kingdom, self-contained, elevated, and culturally curated. Politicians, actors, industrialists, and writers would ascend the hill and enter a world shaped entirely by its host. The architecture would reinforce hierarchy without explicit assertion. It would suggest that power, like stone, could be constructed and preserved. San Simeon did not imitate American domestic architecture. It rejected modesty. It rejected regionalism. It declared itself an exception. But exception requires maintenance. It requires resources that match scale. And by the time the towers stood complete against the Pacific wind, the economic conditions that had fueled their rise were beginning to shift beyond the horizon. Part 4, Chapter 3, Life Inside the Walls. Each evening at San Simeon followed a pattern. Guests dressed for dinner at precisely 8 o'clock. Jackets were required. Hearst himself appeared punctually, often escorted by actress Marion Davies. The dining room ceiling, a 16th-century Spanish artisanado, hovered overhead, its carved panels darkened by age and travel. Beneath it, silverware aligned in symmetrical order. Candles reflected softly against imported Flemish tapestries. The ritual was consistent. Cocktails in the assembly room. Dinner served in courses. Conversation moderated subtly by the host. The architecture structured behavior long before words did. Bedrooms were assigned in advance. Guests did not choose their quarters. Casa del Mar might house Hollywood actors, Casa del Monte might receive politicians or editors. Proximity to Casa Grande signaled intimacy. Distance suggested hierarchy. The climb back to one's room at night, along stone paths bordered by sculpted hedges, reinforced the elevation of the estate itself. Hearst occupied a private Gothic suite at the top of Casa Grande. The room was compact compared to the scale below it, its windows framing the Pacific in controlled increments. From this height, he could observe both guests and horizon. The physical ascent to his quarters mirrored his position within the compound. The estate functioned as an ecosystem. Breakfast was informal. Newspapers, many printed by Hearst's own presses, arrived daily. Guests often discussed headlines that originated within the empire funding the house in which they stood. The circularity was subtle but complete: information generated revenue, revenue reinforced architecture, architecture hosted the individuals who influenced information. The library operated as both sanctuary and instrument. Its shelves contained thousands of volumes, yet silence was rarely absolute. Political conversations unfolded beneath painted zodiac panels. Deals were not always formalized, but alliances were shaped in proximity to carved wood imported from distant monasteries. Morgan's design ensured movement flowed through controlled axes. Corridors framed views intentionally. Windows were positioned not merely for light, but for composition. The Pacific became backdrop. The estate, foreground. Servants moved through separate pathways. Kitchens were concealed. The machine behind the spectacle functioned quietly. Dozens of staff members maintained gardens, polished tiles, prepared meals, operated mechanical systems. Their presence was structural but largely invisible within the formal narrative of the hill. Marion Davies' presence altered the emotional rhythm of the estate. Her laughter, her film screenings in the private theater, her role as companion softened the severity of Gothic ceilings and heraldic emblems. Even so, the building imposed its own gravity. Personal relationships unfolded within rooms defined by imported antiquity. Privacy was partial. Walls were thick, but the social environment was concentrated. Weekends at San Simeon became known as invitations of consequence. Guests included presidents, foreign dignitaries, writers such as George Bernard Shaw, actors including Charlie Chaplin and Greta Garbo. They ascended the hill by invitation only. Access reinforced mystique. Yet the estate was not purely celebratory. Scale creates distance. Casa Grande's assembly room could accommodate dozens, yet intimacy required deliberate effort. Conversations were shaped by acoustics and ceiling height. The Roman pool, with its echoing tile surfaces, magnified sound and gesture. Even leisure carried theatrical undertones. Hearst himself maintained disciplined habits. He rose early. He reviewed proofs and headlines. He telephoned editors from his suite. Business decisions radiated outward from the hill, transmitted by wire and voice to cities hundreds of miles away. The estate did not isolate him from his empire, it elevated him above it. The physical climb to the hill served as psychological transition. Guests entered a curated world detached from urban noise. But detachment is not neutrality. Within the gates, the narrative belonged to the host. Evenings often concluded with film screenings in the private theater. Newsreels, Hollywood productions, occasionally early cuts of Davies' own films. The architecture of the screening room, upholstered seats, controlled lighting, mirrored commercial cinemas owned by Hearst interests. Leisure and industry overlapped seamlessly. Over time, repetition solidified routine. The castle operated less as a seasonal retreat and more as a functioning court. Invitations extended influence. Presence signaled alliance. Absence signaled distance. And yet, beneath the choreography, the financial scaffolding required constant reinforcement. Construction invoices continued. Shipments from Europe arrived irregularly. Decorative programs expanded even as external markets fluctuated. The estate required continuous attention. Gardens demanded irrigation systems that pulled water uphill. Reinforced concrete required maintenance against salt air. Imported ceilings required specialized installation. Within the walls, life appeared stable. Ritual masked volatility. Guests often described the experience as timeless. The architecture achieved its intended effect, it displaced the 20th century and suggested lineage older than the Republic itself. But timelessness inside a building does not suspend economic gravity beyond its gates. As the 1930s approached, the Great Depression altered American wealth dramatically. Circulation numbers fluctuated. Advertising revenues tightened. The empire that funded nightly dinners began to experience structural strain. At San Simeon, the candles were still lit. The pools were still filled. The towers remained immovable against the sky. But the system that sustained the hill no longer expanded at the pace its architecture assumed. In 1937, the financial structure beneath Hearst's empire began to give way. For decades, expansion had been continuous. Newspapers were acquired aggressively. Magazines multiplied. Real estate holdings expanded in parallel. Growth was financed through borrowing, secured by confidence in circulation and influence. As long as revenue climbed, debt appeared manageable. But by the mid-1930s, the economic landscape had shifted irreversibly. The Great Depression constricted advertising revenue, the primary lifeblood of the newspaper business. Readers remained, but advertisers withdrew. Operating costs remained fixed. Expansion loans did not shrink with the market. At San Simeon, construction had never truly stopped. Even as the national economy contracted, Morgan continued refining terraces, redesigning pools, installing imported fragments from Europe. The hill functioned as if the larger financial environment were stable. In 1937, bankers intervened. Hearst's companies were forced into financial reorganization. Control shifted quietly from personal command to structured oversight. A group of trustees was appointed to manage assets and stabilize debt. The scale of obligation had grown too large to ignore. Newspapers were consolidated. Magazines were sold. Properties across the country were evaluated for liquidation. San Simeon, the most visible symbol of accumulation, stood at the center of this reassessment. The estate's operating costs were substantial. Staff salaries, maintenance, utilities, ongoing construction, all required steady capital. The compound had never been conceived as a revenue-generating property. It was a private projection of influence, dependent entirely on the profitability of distant presses. Now those presses could no longer guarantee permanence. Hearst did not immediately abandon the hill. Life continued, though altered. Construction slowed. Decorative programs paused. Certain acquisitions were cancelled before shipment. The estate remained occupied, but expansion ceased to be automatic. The psychological shift was subtle but decisive. For nearly 2 decades, the hill had grown in direct correlation to its owner's confidence. Each new tower or imported ceiling signaled forward motion. Now, the physical structure was largely complete, and the financial system that justified its existence was contracting. The architecture could not adjust its scale to match new realities. Creditors evaluated holdings dispassionately. Land values were assessed. Art collections were inventoried. Across the country, Hearst properties were sold to reduce debt. In New York, the Hearst building remained. In California, assets were streamlined. The empire narrowed. San Simeon endured, but not untouched. It became a liability measured in maintenance costs rather than a platform for influence. Invitations grew fewer. The guest list shortened. The theater still screened films, but the audience thinned. By the early 1940s, the United States had entered another global conflict. Wartime rationing affected materials and labor. The cultural appetite for extravagant display diminished in the shadow of war. The estate's theatrical scale contrasted sharply with national austerity. Hearst aged visibly. His health declined. In 1947, after suffering a series of strokes, he left San Simeon for the final time. The departure was not ceremonial. It was practical. The hill he had shaped over nearly 3 decades would no longer serve as his primary residence. He died in 1951 in Beverly Hills. The castle remained. Without its architect patron, the compound's purpose shifted immediately. The rituals that had defined it, structured dinners, curated guest hierarchies, nightly screenings, ceased. Marion Davies retained affection for the property, but the system of influence that animated it could not be reconstructed without its originator. Financial pressures did not vanish with his death. The Hearst Corporation, reorganized and stabilized under trusteeship, operated with increased fiscal restraint. The estate, once a projection of personal myth-making, was now an inherited asset requiring decision. The breaking point had not been architectural. No earthquake fractured the towers. No fire consumed imported ceilings. The rupture was economic and structural, invisible from a distance, but irreversible. The hill had been built to immortalize an empire at its peak. It reached completion at the precise moment that empire's unchecked expansion ended. Stone remained intact. But intention had shifted permanently. In 1957, 6 years after William Randolph Hearst's death, the Hearst family made a decision that altered the identity of the hill permanently. San Simeon was donated to the state of California. The transfer was not an act of theatrical generosity. It was structured, negotiated, practical. The estate's scale and maintenance costs made private preservation increasingly impractical. The Hearst Corporation had stabilized, but it had also adopted discipline. The era of unchecked personal expenditure had ended. The Enchanted Hill would no longer function as a private court. It would become a state historical monument. Public access began the following year. The transformation required subtle recalibration. Rooms once calibrated for hierarchy were reinterpreted for guided tours. Pathways once reserved for invited guests were open to visitors who arrived in buses rather than chauffeured cars. The climb to the ridge remained deliberate, but the exclusivity dissolved. Architecture that had enforced social rank now required explanation. Docents described imported ceilings. They recounted stories of visiting actors and presidents. They translated heraldic symbols into historical context. The Neptune pool, once reserved for a select circle, became a photographed landmark. The Roman pool's cobalt tiles reflected camera flashes instead of candlelight. The building did not resist this change. Its stone towers remained steady against coastal wind. Reinforced concrete continued to anchor terraces into the hillside. Gardens required pruning. Systems required maintenance. But the meaning of the estate shifted fundamentally. It no longer projected the authority of a single man. Instead, it functioned as an artifact, an exhibit of ambition rendered permanent in stone. The state preserved rooms not as living spaces, but as historical compositions. Beds remained made. Dining tables were set as if awaiting guests who would never return. The estate's survival depended on reinterpretation. Over the decades, conservation efforts focused on stabilizing imported materials. Salt air corroded metal fixtures. Earthquakes required structural assessment. Morgan's engineering proved resilient. Reinforced concrete, once concealed beneath decorative surfaces, ensured the compound endured tremors that might have compromised less modern construction. Revenue now flowed from tourism rather than headlines. Admission fees replaced circulation profits as the economic justification for upkeep. The machine that once connected newspapers to architecture had been severed. In its place stood a different mechanism: heritage management. The estate began to outlive the context that created it. Visitors walked through the assembly room unaware of the daily editorial decisions once made on the hill. The library's carved ceiling suggested European antiquity, but its original owner's empire had become a diversified media corporation operating in a different century. The physical structure remained anchored in the early 20th century, even as its corporate lineage evolved elsewhere. There were moments of vulnerability. In 2003, the San Simeon earthquake, magnitude 6.6, struck the region. Plaster cracked. Some artifacts were damaged. Conservation teams responded carefully. The towers held. Morgan's structural foresight, once overshadowed by decorative spectacle, proved decisive. The hill endured not because of ornament, but because of engineering. Temporary closures followed. Restoration required patience. The state invested in stabilization not for private prestige, but for public continuity. Meanwhile, the surrounding landscape shifted gradually. Highways improved access. Tourism increased. The isolation that once defined the ranch softened. What had been remote became reachable within a day's drive from Los Angeles or San Francisco. And yet, despite public presence, the estate retained a quality of distance. Visitors moved through designated paths. Rope barriers prevent contact with certain surfaces. Bedrooms remain undisturbed. The Gothic suite, once the operational center of an empire, is observed through thresholds rather than occupied. The architecture continues to impose separation, even in its public phase. The estate has neither collapsed nor returned to its original function. It has mutated. Its original purpose, to stage personal power at the summit of media influence, cannot be restored. The newspapers that financed it have adapted to digital environments unimaginable during its construction. The political ambitions that once animated its gatherings belong to another era. But the hill does not dissolve. Instead, it stands as physical evidence of a moment when private wealth sought permanence through architecture. It has outlived the urgency of that moment. It has outlived its creator. It has even outlived the economic structure that made its scale plausible. The Enchanted Hill survives not as a fortress of empire, but as a preserved contradiction, a monument to ambition maintained by the public it once sought to impress. Stone towers still overlook the Pacific. The doors still close against the wind. But the authority they were meant to embody has become historical rather than active, interpreted rather than exercised. Late afternoon light settles unevenly across the terraces of San Simeon. The Pacific darkens first, then the gardens. Shadows lengthen beneath the colonnades of the Neptune pool. The water lies still, unbroken by conversation. Inside Casa Grande, the assembly room holds its furniture in patient arrangement. The 16th century ceiling remains suspended overhead, its carved geometry untouched by the passing decades. Tapestries hang without movement. The dining table is set as though 8 o'clock might arrive again with purpose. Footsteps echo differently now. They move in measured groups, guided, contained. The library's shelves still carry thousands of volumes, but no editor telephones instructions from the Gothic suite above. The theater's seats remain aligned, yet the projector is silent. No guest waits for invitation. No hierarchy determines proximity to the host. Wind presses lightly against bronze doors at the entrance. The towers absorb it without reply. From the ridge, the coastline appears unchanged. The ocean advances and withdraws with mechanical indifference. Cattle no longer cross the hill, but the grass continues to move under the same current of air that once touched unfinished scaffolding. The estate was constructed to suggest endurance, to translate influence into stone and tile. It has endured. But endurance is not the same as control. The empire that financed these terraces adapted, reorganized, survived in altered form. The man who imagined this summit is absent. The rituals that animated these rooms exist only in description. What remains is elevation. A hill transformed into architecture. Towers positioned against sky. Rooms preserved in suspended readiness. If permanence was the intention, the structure has achieved it in material form. But as evening closes around the enchanted hill and the last visitors descend the winding road, the question lingers quietly in the stone. Can architecture truly secure the power that created it, or does it merely record the moment before that power begins to recede?